The most shocking recent political event for lots of people was the election of Mr. Trump to the most powerful political office in the world, despite having zero experience in politics. That happened in November 2016, but earlier that year, the British electorate decided to take the country out of the European Union.
No way back for Remain.
In a number of countries in the rich world, very kind of anti-foreign right-wing parties have come to prominence. The Netherlands, in Finland, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Austria, countries which have been traditionally associated with center-left sort of liberal values. And this has made a lot of people ask questions about why this is happening. The supporters of these anti-foreign, anti-immigrant parties are often described as angry people who are angry because they have been left behind in the evolution of the global economy in the last few decades. Now, the term globalization was invented by an American business school professor whose name no one remembers now. We invent concepts and terms all the time to describe new things, and it was one of those. But suddenly in the 1990s, it took off. And at least since the mid-1990s, it has been the defining concept of our time. The basic definition of globalization is increasing flows of goods, services, capital, people. Although a lot of people who talk about globalization try not to talk about immigration, because it's a politically sensitive issue, and people who are gung-ho about greater openness towards goods and capital are not very positive about opening borders for people. So that's an interesting kind of inconsistency. But there's now a kind of more comprehensive definition which says it's not just about increased flows, but also about changing global rules. Now, these international rules sometimes force countries to change their domestic rules as well. Because sometimes it's just about not having tariff, not putting special conditions for foreign investors. That's more straightforward. But now, this the universal rules idea has spread so much that now countries are expected to change their corporate accounting practices to fit with the sort of Western practices. They have been expected to change their rules on patents, government procurement, lots of things that we had thought were not subject to international negotiation are now coming under this set of common rules. So the impact is much greater than just border control, if you like. Now, according to the dominant discourse, globalization happens because of technology. Technologies of communications, transportation, they have become a lot more developed with the development of digital technology. Now even information can be moved around. So, when you do, MRI scan of a patient in Boston, you can send it to actually India so that someone can read it there at a much lower wage rate and send it back. These technological changes have created, in popular expression, the death of distance. Distance doesn't matter anymore. And this has enabled us to deploy resources where they have the highest productivity. We are not bound by national borders anymore. And until they were wrong-footed by the 2008 financial crisis, many of our political leaders and leading economists, names like Jagdish Bhagwati and Jeffrey Sachs come to mind, were singing praises of globalization. Robert Rubin, who was the US Treasury Secretary, or what would be called finance minister in other countries, because of globalization and open market and the spread of market-based system, the world is a much better place. Kofi Annan was even more enthused about this, saying that this is not just about prosperity in the rich countries, but the only realistic way of pulling billions of people out of poverty. This was like trying to fight against the law of gravity. Or Robert McCormick, the chairman of the International Chambers of Commerce, said in 2003 World Economic Forum in Davos, people who are trying to stop this was against progress. And Mr. McCormick deliberately likened the anti-globalization protesters who are shouting outside these the venues in Davos, look, these are like the Luddites. Luddites are these the English textile artisans who lost their jobs to textile machines in the early 19th century, and at least some of them thought they could bring the jobs back if they destroy the machines. So they have become the byword for people who are fighting the inevitable, trying to turn the clock back. And Mr. McCormick was saying, you are against globalization, you are basically against progress. So there was a lot of confidence that this process will bring prosperity, lift people out of poverty. This is a unique chance for the humanity to leap to the next level. And they recommended, therefore, countries need to open up their borders. I mean, the most immediate one was trade liberalization. So reduce tariffs, ideally abolish it, but you might need some revenue from it. So reduce it to a very low level. Get rid of quantitative restrictions like quotas. In addition to trade, investment was also liberalized. Previously, there were lots of restrictions on how much foreigners can invest in the financial market and what kind of assets they could acquire. I mean, many of these regulations have been abolished. So now, there were huge financial flows coming into the so-called emerging markets, basically middle-income countries, which used to have rather severe restrictions on financial flows. Poorer countries are cautious about liberalizing finance capital, but a lot of them embraced foreign direct investment. So foreign direct investment is, actually there's no agreed analytical definition because basically it means someone acquiring a stake and a say in management in a company that does production activity within your national border, and that someone happens to be a foreigner. Now, sometimes it's what people call greenfield investment. So Intel, out of the blue, comes into Costa Rica and builds the microchip factory. But it could be also what people call brownfield investment. There's, some ailing car company in Turkey, and Volkswagen comes and buys it up. Now, this kind of investment has been particularly praised for its stability and also its ability to provide technology as well as finance capital. Until the 80s, 90s, a lot of countries had restrictions on what foreign investors could do. So there will be rules on which sectors they can invest. There will be sectors that are completely closed off to foreigners. There might be requirement that the majority owner should be local. Countries could say, well, you have to source more than 50% of inputs from local producers, the ratio going up to 85% in 10 years. These kind of conditions are very common. But now a lot of countries have abolished this in an attempt to attract foreign capital, especially in the form of the foreign direct investment. And many of them have also changed their domestic policy to create what is euphemistically called business-friendly environment. So cut the corporate tax rate, reduce the workers' rights so that foreign companies can exploit them more readily, deregulate business, and this has changed policy regimes in many countries. Having made these recommendations, the proponents of this path admitted that yes, in the short run, there might be some losers from the process. Yeah? So, I don't know, the US that opens up its, say, automobile market or signs the free trade agreement with Mexico. This might make some local auto workers to lose jobs because there'll be more imports from, say, Korea. You know? And some of the American companies might relocate some of their factories to Mexico. You know? These things have happened. Huh? But the argument was that, yes, in the short run this will happen, but in the long run, these people will be actually better off because in the long run, they'll be doing much better paying jobs. You know? Because with this liberalization and free trade agreement, the US will be exporting more, say, investment banking services or software to countries like Korea and Mexico. And therefore, these people will eventually get jobs that are better and better paying than the ones they used to have. Well, that is the theory. In reality, how many former auto workers in the United States who have turned themselves into IT engineers, not to speak of investment bankers? Huh? I mean, one very striking evidence is that in the United States, the median, not the average, median wage has been basically stagnant since the mid-1970s, despite the fact that the country's real per capita income, that is inflation-adjusted per capita income, has more than doubled during that period. Now, why do people get left behind in this process? Well, the short answer is because it's costly to get retrained. Yeah, in theory, you could become an investment banker, but that might mean going back to the college, doing the master's degree, and kind of doing lots of jobs before you can get hired by an investment banking company. I mean, very few people have the resources and time and perseverance to do that. So as a result, only a small number of people who got unemployed through these changes have been employed in jobs that are better paying than what they were doing before. Most of them are either languishing in long-term unemployment or have ended up in low-skilled jobs like security guard, shelf stacking in the supermarkets, or mail stripping, as in the British movie The Full Monty. This is a movie about 6 unemployed Sheffield steel workers, or rather ex-steel workers. So in technical terms, in the standard model of international trade known as Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model, named after 2 Swedish economists of the early 20th century, and later Paul Samuelson, the economist who sold the largest number of textbooks in history of economics between the 1950s and 80s. Samuelson formalized what Heckscher and Ohlin theorized in the early 20th century. And this is the standard theory that is used to defend free trade. Like all theories, it makes lots of assumptions. And one of the critical assumption there is full factor mobility. This means that capital or labor can be easily transferred to other sectors if the demand for their original sectors fall. So if demand for auto workers fall and people will move into investment banking, if American steel industry goes down, somehow you can remold the steel mill into a factory that produces the microchips. Put in this way, it sounds ridiculous, but that is the theoretical assumption behind this model. And basically, when that assumption doesn't hold, you have this phenomenon of people being left behind. Defenders of globalization have argued that essentially there is acceleration of growth from this process, which will create more wealth, which will then trickle down to the bottom eventually. So it's a matter of the adjustment. It will happen in the end. Now, despite the bad press that it often gets, trickle-down is not necessarily a stupid theory. What it is saying is that you have to look at the second or even third round effects of something. So the simple fact that I don't know, trade liberalization has made some American workers that lose their jobs, doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be worse off in the end, because that process could have, I'm not saying that it necessarily has, but could have created more wealth, which will then create more demand for other things, which will then create more jobs and more income and so on. Now, of course, in reality, that trickle down has not happened. Many governments do lots of things to basically, A, reduce the number of the losers from the process of globalization, and B, compensate the losers through public means. The one thing that has been permanently going on is protection of agriculture in some of the rich countries. In countries like Japan, Norway, Switzerland, they have this agricultural sector which is, by international standard, very unproductive. But they deliberately keep these people in the agricultural sector, partly to maintain their tradition, partly to prevent the depopulation of the rural areas, but also in recognition of the fact that if exposed to the market forces, these people will just disappear and they won't be able to convert themselves into investment banking or IT engineering. The US has provided huge amount of protection and subsidies to the steel industry while pretending that it practices free trade, because the steel industry is too large and politically too important just to be left to go bankrupt. Of course, all these measures are costly. In the end, a lot of things are wound down. But a lot of countries are doing things in recognition that you will have a lot of people that are thrown into the scrap heap of history if you just let these global market forces reign. Governments can do something more proactive to help people to find new jobs. And the Scandinavian countries have been particularly good at this. They call this active labor market policy, which means that instead of just saying that, you have lost your job, you should find another job, they provide subsidized the training. They try to help people look for jobs. Very often, the problem is that when you lose your job in, say, the town that used to make ships and somehow get retrained and try to move to another town to work as a software engineer, you often have to sell your house to buy another one, and then the finance becomes very tricky. So the government in Sweden has even given temporary loans to these people to be able to buy a new house and pay them back when they sell their original house. So you can do this range of things to improve labor mobility. So when you have winners from some economic process, whether it's trade liberalization or technological progress, the government can collect more taxes from them because they now have higher income, and use that to compensate the losers by providing them with income support, unemployment benefit, subsidized training, access to basic services. And this has helped a lot of people, maybe still fall behind, but not so dramatically as their counterparts in countries with a smaller welfare state would do. If you are talking about the rough size of the welfare state, so in Western Europe, it's typically around 25% of GDP. Many countries have about 30%, France, Finland, Belgium. In the US, it's about 20%. In South Korea, it's 10%. In countries like Korea and the US, income support, unemployment benefit, these are minuscule. A lot of people have a very tough life once they lose their jobs. Because the factor mobility, especially labor mobility, is rather low, the market mechanism cannot fully compensate the losers, and therefore the governments have had to intervene a lot through various means, welfare state, labor market, trade protection, in order to minimize the negative consequences from this. given this the problem of insufficient compensation, you would ask whether, as a neoclassical economist who believe in Pareto criterion, you should endorse all this process. A lot of neoclassical economists have advocated globalization, fully knowing that it will create a lot of losers, on the ground that the aggregate gains of the winners is going to be bigger than the aggregate losses of the losers. Therefore, in theory, you can compensate all the losers, and the winners will still have left something behind. This is known as the compensation principle in the neoclassical welfare economics. But if you believed in that, you have to make sure that this compensation is made. Yeah? If it is not made, the neoclassical economists are doing the same thing as the people they used to condemn, like the utilitarian philosophers or the Marxist economists who demanded sacrifice of a minority for the greater good. Because what they are saying is liberalized trade, some people get left behind, it's still okay because the aggregate wealth is greater. That's not Pareto. That's completely against the Pareto principle. I mean, what's the difference between that and Stalin, who said, well, we can kill a few million people in order to make the great nation better off. So there's a serious philosophical and ethical question here. In the absence of full trickle-down, in the absence of full compensation, the result of globalization has been broadly increasing inequality. It hasn't happened in all countries, but in about 2/3 of the countries, inequality has risen since the 1980s, and in some countries in a very dramatic way. Globalization has been going on for at least 2 centuries. Some people say 5 centuries. But I'm talking about the last 30, 40 years. The problem with this, the current phase of globalization is that it has failed to produce accelerated growth. Because when these pro-market, pro-liberalization policies, commonly known as neoliberal policies, came into stream in the 1980s, it was very much predicated on that argument. Growth is faltering, entrepreneurship is being choked by the government regulation. We need to revive the economy, open it up, deregulate, increase competition. That will drive people to become more productive. But when you look at the evidence, that is not what has happened. Now, before actually looking at the evidence, let me make one point. We very often hear that thanks to globalization, we are richer than ever. In itself, it doesn't really mean anything because we will be richer than ever as far as our economy is growing faster than population. So the relevant question is whether we are doing better than what we used to, and the evidence tells you that it isn't the case. Roughly speaking, for a few decades after the Second World War, the world economy was growing very healthily, 2.6%. In the next 35 years, growth has markedly slowed down. Basically, it has been halved down to 1.4%. So we might be richer than ever, but these numbers tell you that we could have been even richer. If we maintain the previous rates of growth, we will be even richer. Most countries in this earlier period were actually using rather interventionist policies, and they had a lot more restrictions on internationalization of the economy. Globalization was a very controlled affair in those days. Although there was gradual liberalization, even the rich countries had capital control. They had tariffs, all kinds of trade restrictions on foreign direct investment. So that makes you think, how come you had this period when most countries were using bad policies and the world economy grew much faster than what they have been in the last three and a half decades, when lots of things have been liberalized, opened up, and so on. Now, when you say this, some people say, oh, yes, but, you have to put this into context. At least the last 3-4 decades of globalization has lifted a huge number of people out of poverty, especially in developing countries like China and India. In worldwide terms, the working class people who have been hit very hard by the globalization process in the rich countries, yeah, they probably belong to the top 10, 20% of the world income distribution. So some people have accused these people of being, really spoiled. I mean, you belong to top 10, 20% of the world, and you want to introduce all these restrictions on international trade and investment, which will make it more difficult, people down the ladder, like poor Chinese people and so on, to pull themselves out of poverty so that you can maintain some kind of relative position in your own economy. Now, there's some truth in that argument, but I think the argument has quite a number of serious problems. First of all, it is not just the working class people in the rich countries that have been left behind. A lot of people in developing countries have also been left behind. So if you look at especially regions like Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, which have most diligently implemented the neoliberal policies under pressure from the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which basically put a lot of conditions on their loans, their growth in the brave new world has collapsed. You go to Latin America, a lot of people complain about the bad old days of import substitution. Per capita income in the region used to grow at over 3% per year in that period, and in the subsequent 30 years, the growth rate is not even 1% per year. Sub-Saharan Africa was even worse. Even in the 60s and 70s, it was growing at 1.6% in per capita terms per year. Yeah, not super rate, but it's not something to be scoffed at, because this is essentially the rate that today's rich countries grew during their industrial revolution. It looks bad only because you are comparing it to rate in Korea or Taiwan, that 5-6% per year. But in the next 30 years, the annual average growth rate was 0.2%. This means that after 30 years, Sub-Saharan Africa's per capita income was only 6% higher than what it was 30 years ago. In a good year, China grows that much in 6 months. Now, given that the rich countries during this period grew between 1.5 and 2% per year, this means that Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa have been left behind. And the gap between them and the rich countries have vastly widened. And unbeknownst to the outside world, China experiences literally hundreds of thousands of industrial strikes, local riots, demonstrations. You could go to these Chinese people and say, you should still be happy because you have become richer, and Brazil has much worse income distribution than you. It doesn't work because inequality matters only because you think you belong to a certain group. If I told you that there are 55 planets in the universe, which is that kind of intelligent beings, and all of them are vastly richer than the Earth, would you care? I wouldn't. I mean, I can't even go there. Probably some of the delicacies that these beings eat are toxic to me. No, this is not to devalue the kind of material progress that China has achieved in the last few decades. It's been truly impressive, but don't think that this makes all Chinese people happy. There are lots of angry people there. Now, having said that, I think we need to be positive and realize that it is possible to minimize the number of losers from this process and actually compensate them more generously. And indeed, a lot of countries have done this. Yeah? So if you look at the income inequality statistics, you will realize that despite having a much more open economy than the United States, the Netherlands and Canada have seen no negative change in income inequality in the last few decades. Income inequality has risen a little bit in Germany, Japan, and Italy, but only marginally. And in Switzerland, there's even evidence that at least in the 1990s, income inequality fell. Now, these are interesting facts because we have been told that these forces of globalization cannot be stopped. Everyone has to just accept them. We have been told that these forces shouldn't be stopped because it's driven by technological progress, and therefore trying to meddle with them, but is trying to turn the clock back. No, that's not true. A lot of countries have done things to contain the effects, and despite having one of the least open economies in the rich world, the US has experienced huge increase in inequality from what already was one of the highest levels among the rich world, exactly because it used different policies. There's a smaller welfare state. It's the corporate governance system is much more pro-corporate. Labor law is much more anti-labor. So the typical reaction from the angry people in the U.S. is all because of the Chinese. It's all because of factories moving to Mexico. But the real reason for increased inequality and the mass production of angry people in the US lie actually elsewhere. Because other countries have shown that despite being far more open to international economic forces, they could contain inequality. Now, there's another interesting historical fact that corroborates this point. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, roughly between 1870 and 1914, there was another high point of globalization. Roughly speaking, during this period, the world economy was basically as globalized as it is today. In some ways, it was more globalized, in some ways less. What were the technologies that they used to achieve that degree of globalization? Basically, steamships and wired, not even wireless, telegraph. In contrast, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we had basically all the technologies of communication and transportation that we have today, except for the internet. In those days, there were already airplanes, there were fax machines. Despite that, that period was much less globalized than the earlier period in the late 19th, early 20th century, basically showing that technology is not a defining factor. The world economy was much less globalized in the early post-Second World War period compared to the late 19th, early 20th century, exactly because countries deliberately controlled the degree of globalization, partly through national policies, partly through international agreements. So even today, we shouldn't accept the outcomes of this globalization as a force of nature that we can avoid. A lot of countries have done lots of things to change the outcome. Once you begin to think that this is some irresistible force of nature, then you basically lose control of your destiny.